Hello, and welcome back to ATA Live. I am your host, John Humphreys from the ATA. ATA standing for the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. Link down the bottom, taxpayers.org.au. They're the ones that put this together for us and give us this chance to chat twice a week, which is Mondays and Thursdays at 8:30 p.m. Sydney and Melbourne time, or New South Wales and Victoria time, 7:30 Queensland time, and everyone else can work out their own outcome. So we put this on as a twice a week opportunity to chat about, well, politics and policy, chat about politics with the intention of trying to add a bit more policy or policy detail to the discussion about politics, not just poll watching, we do a bit of that as well, but uh, we have lamented the lack of serious policy discussion in not just this political campaign, but in recent political campaigns. And we can lament it all we like. What are we going to do about it? Well, this is what we're going to do about it. We're going to chat a couple of times a week and try to explore some policy ideas in a bit more depth. And as the name might give it away, the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, we occasionally talk about tax, and especially the thing I've been going on about for quite a while now, the fact that the income tax rates in Australia are far too high. And this has been not only exacerbating the cost of living problems and pressures that everyone's facing, but it's holding back productivity. And we've been in a productivity slump for 8 years now. So this is one of the policy issues that I am going to touch on another idea along those lines in this session today. So we've been going through a few different tax cutting ideas, and I'm going to put another one on the table today. But first, sort of cover something that's happened. So first, I should say this is going out simulcast on YouTube, X, and Facebook. It's going out often on the Australian Taxpayers Alliance channels. I don't think it's going to the ATA on X this time around, but it goes to the ATA channel on YouTube and on Facebook, and it goes to my personal channels on YouTube, Facebook, and X. So if you haven't yet, please go around and look for that for John Humphreys and/or Australian Taxpayers Alliance on those platforms, and give us a follow. That is harmless, free on your side. It helps make sure we can keep in touch with you and keep doing what we're doing. And if right now, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, so if you're watching this, please stop, pause, give it a like, makes it a bit easier for us, and give it a share so we can get this going. I look at the comments coming in as they come in. If we're saying something, if I'm saying something you think is brilliant or idiotic, please feel free to tell me. We can get involved in the back and forth if there is any good bant. So sometimes I've often got a plan for something I want to say, but if the comments are good, we can just easily get distracted. Happy to get distracted, throw up some difficult questions, and I will see how much of a fool I can make of myself. So we'll do that. So there is a tax policy discussion that I wanted to dive into in this session. But before I do that, I wanted to take a little detour because we had, of course, in the last 24 hours, Donald Trump announcing his new range of tariff measures, which has sparked off a whole series of debates for and against tariffs, for and against trade. And I'm not going to solve that for you here today, but I did want to add a few extra points to consider. So I feel like on the right of center politics, suddenly a lot of people have become quite enamored of tariffs lately. And there are some decent arguments for tariffs. I don't want to say that all the arguments are on one side. That is never true. Life is about trade-offs. So like perfect solutions, there are just trade-offs you make in life. So I'm not pretending that tariffs don't have an appeal, but perhaps in this current zeitgeist, it may be that a few people have forgotten or perhaps never were properly had explained to them some of the costs associated with tariffs. So I just wanted to flag those for this moment. Now, I'm not trying to solve the tariff debate. And I would also note that there are some just good strategic geopolitical reasons potentially to have tariffs, which it could just be that you're playing some game theory, right? You're threatening to do it to change other people's behavior, which may well be a lot of what Trump is doing in the US. It's hard to see inside the man's heart and soul, but it may well be. And to that degree, that's great. That's fine. That's geopolitics. That's a different topic, right? So they're getting into the benefits and costs of tariffs is a moot point if the whole purpose of the tariff is to get rid of tariffs. So I get that. I get that response and rebuttal and potential rationale for Trump's behavior. nonetheless, I think it is fair to say that there is a growing cohort of Trump followers or people on the right of center who are becoming enamored with tariffs. If you were listening along on Monday when I had Dan Ryan in the room, we didn't delve too much into that debate. We are planning on doing that debate at some stage, in which case we'll do it properly. But I think Dan is representative of that segment of right of center politics that have decided that tariffs aren't just a necessary evil. Sometimes they might be a positive good. And if he were in the room, I'm sure he would be making the case for various things that tariffs do good. I just want to, if you're one of those people, I want you to factor in these considerations. Not that it overrules or knocks out your argument, but I think it is fair to say if we're going to look at a policy, we should look at the benefits and the costs. I mean, when I say that aloud, it is so transparently obvious that you should look at benefits and costs. But so often in policy discussion, we don't have that. We have one side deciding they love something and they just do a benefit analysis, and one side deciding they hate something and they do a cost analysis. And that probably makes for good politics. But of course, as I said at the beginning, the remit we've set ourselves in these chats is to not just do politics, perhaps to try and reintroduce good policy back into the discussion of politics. And we're going to try to do that now. So a benefit cost analysis, if you're an advocate for tariffs, that's fine. Perhaps you are right. But if you are, I think it's fair to say that you have honestly factored in the cost. So anyway, enough of that by way of introduction. Here's just a couple of costs I want people to make sure they're considering. Some imports, things that we import into Australia, or whichever country you're considering, but we're in Australia. Some imports are used as inputs, very similar words, as inputs in the production process. So some things our businesses in Australia import from overseas, use in their business to produce something else, and then create an output. Now, that's just not some business, that is a lot of businesses. Now, that's just something we need to consider. A tariff on imported inputs is actually known as negative protection. There's a thing called the effective rate of protection, the ERP in trade economics. The effective rate of protection is, that you get protected if there is a tariff on what you're selling. But there's effectively negative protection, like the government is proactively harming Australian industry if there is a tariff on what you are importing as an input into your production process. Right, so if you are producing houses in Australia, and for housing you need a certain amount, I mean, I don't know how to make a house, so I don't even know what the inputs are, so me doing examples probably isn't the right way to go, but let's just say that they need a certain amount of nails, and then we increase the tariff on imported nails. If that just drives up the price of nails, that's actually driving up the costs of the Australian house producer, or the Australian, what's something we could export. If we've got an export product or an import competing product, and well, I'm going too deep into examples without putting specifics on it, so I might just pause there, but hopefully you get the concept, hopefully you get the idea. If you are putting a tariff on something that Australian industries are using as an input, you aren't protecting an Australian industry, you are proactively harming the Australian industry. You are putting on what's like effectively negative protection. And there are industries in which when you add up all the tariffs on the inputs and tariffs on the outputs produced in a country, there have been plenty of examples in the past where the effective rate of protection was negative, i.e. tariffs were actually costing Australian industry more than they were protecting Australian industry. So that's the first thing to consider. That's not a knockout blow, but I mean, you have to factor that in. Anything you're putting a tariff on, who in Australia is using that tariff in the production process, does it drive up their costs, and therefore they have to let off a few workers and they have to drive down their wages a bit. If the goal is protect Australian industry and Australian wages and employment in those Australian industries being protected, if it does the exact opposite, then what are we doing? Now, the other thing to factor in is too often this discussion is done in this abstract concept of how Ricardo explained comparative advantage. And I understand that's very abstract. So I just, very specifically, it needs to be understood if a tariff is successful in decreasing imports, it is inherently and axiomatically also going to decrease exports. Right? Decreasing trade is going to decrease trade in both directions. Right? I mean, if Australians stop buying foreign goods, that is going to significantly drive up the value of the Aussie dollar. You drive up the value of the Aussie dollar, our goods look more expensive to foreigners. Foreigners buy fewer of our goods. And that's just an inevitable way that the system works. And that's fine, and that might be a good thing, but we just need to be honest about what's going on, right? Decreasing trade doesn't just decrease imports, it decreases imports and exports. And that helps and hurts different industries, right? So that's going to help an industry that is an import competitor. So if you have a business and you're competing against a bunch of imports, then that tariff helps you. But obviously that tariff, because it decreases imports and it decreases exports, if you're an exporter, that tariff drives up the value of the Aussie dollar, therefore it makes your products more expensive overseas. So it's not like tariffs are just protecting industry full stop. It's protecting some industries and hurting other industries. And again, maybe that's what you want to do. Maybe it makes sense. Maybe that's a good thing. But we need to just be honest about what's going on here, right? So tariffs create positive protection for some, negative protection for others. And tariffs protect some import competing industries, but they harm our export industries. And so you've got to balance both sides. And it is worth noting that our export industries kind of by definition are the more efficient, productive ones. I mean, they're productive enough that they're world beating, right? We're selling on the world. They do then tend to make higher profits and pay higher wages. So if we are proactively and intentionally making a shift that we want to shrink our export markets, we want to shrink our exporting businesses, shrink our exporting industries, and we want to increase the size of our import competing businesses, if that's a decision we want to make, and maybe there's a good reason for it, just be aware that you are almost certainly then decreasing the total amount of wages and profits that can be paid in the jobs in those industries. And again, maybe it's worth it, but when you're doing a cost benefit analysis, let's be honest about the costs, honest about the benefits, and then decide if it's worth doing. What I've said here obviously isn't the end of the discussion. There's a bunch of reasons back and forth, and maybe I'll get a chance to do that with Dan in the near future. But it did occur to me that perhaps some people weren't aware of some of the costs of tariffs and why you may want to be a bit more cautious than some people have been. By the way, this argument is against the idea of tariffs that are effectively stopping trade. If the idea is you're putting on a fairly mild tariff that still allows trade, but you're raising a bit of money, then sure, you're driving up the price of things, but it's a revenue raiser, it's a tax, as we've discussed before. I'm not a fan of taxes in general, but a small tax generally has a small cost. A large tax has an exponentially larger cost. So if we are introducing a small tariff and trading away massive income tax cuts, that argument could make some sense. So my discussion I've had up till now was just talking to the people who think it's a good idea to have tariffs so as to decrease trade. I just wanted them to make sure they were fully internalizing the costs associated with that. So anyway, that was my trade rant. We'll do this again with a protectionist in the room, because that'll make it more fun to be able to go back and forth. We'll see if I've had any protectionists coming in to throw rocks at me on the side. No? Well, I like the comment. I agree with you, but yeah, we're going on segues. I'll go on those segues instead. Australia effectively bans almost all beef imports on biosecurity grounds. It's cost prohibitive to comply. Yeah, no, so Australia is not innocent in this regard. I mean, there is no country that is innocent in this regard. A lot of countries have learnt some trade tricks, which is to decrease their tariffs and say that they are pro-trade, and then come up with other reasons to effectively restrict trade so as to protect the local industry. And again, that protection of local industry is sort of by definition putting up the value of the Aussie dollar and hurting our export industries. So I mean, it is these non-tariff barriers, as they're called, still have many of the same costs or negatives that I've just discussed before. And Australia has a bunch of non-tariff barriers that we very cheekily use. And of course, you wrap those up in very virtuous sounding reasons, right? We're protecting our labor standards, we're protecting our environment, we're protecting the uniqueness of something, the spotted nose wombat or whatever it is. You always wrap it up in virtuous language and sell it that way to the voting public. But often the effect is to recreate a trade barrier. And Australia has done that in many different areas. And if what Trump is doing is he's trying to play geopolitics, he's trying to do brinkmanship to get other people to lower their barriers, then that's great. That makes perfect sense as a strategy if you can get away with it, if you can make it work, which is a whole series of geopolitical questions, which it's a whole different conversation, which is worth having and may well be worth doing. And if America can get Australia to drop some of our non-tariff barriers, then perhaps it can be win-win. But you notice that it's win-win because you achieve more trade. So it's not win-win because you blocked trade in that instance. So the whole premise of the geopolitical argument for these tariffs is built on the idea that we all understand that trade generally does make you more wealthy. And we understand that because it's just pretty bloody true, obviously so. That is true. He does describe himself as that, although I found it interesting when Rennick describes himself as a protectionist, he often goes on and says he wants to protect other things that aren't related to an import competing industry. So I suspect he uses the word protectionist in quite an expansive way. And in a way that when he describes it, half the time I end up being quite sympathetic to what he's trying to talk about. So I'm not sure if he's using the word protectionist in the exact same way that a lot of trade economists would take the word out of a textbook. But that's fine. Yeah, people can use their own language. Look, I quite enjoy the way Rennick argues. I think he's wrong on a few issues. I think he's right on a lot. And I think he's willing to be unique and different and interesting and thoughtful and think it through himself. And I would much prefer to engage with someone who is intellectually kind of curious and thoughtful and sometimes wrong, but they're wrestling with the ideas and they're not coming to tell me. I've argued with Reddick over the phone several times. We should do it publicly one time, but it's nearly always just private conversations. And he's never come back to me and said, this idea is right because I've poll tested it and it's popular amongst the demographic, the 25 to 45-year-olds living in Werriwa or whatever it is. He's always just argued the veracity of his case as he sees it. And I think that's because he genuinely does mean it and he gets there through thinking. And that means the conversation is worth having. And there's not enough people in Australian politics who get to their conclusions by trying to work it through and nut it out and argue with people. And so I appreciate him for that. I still think he's wrong on a few issues, but I would much prefer to deal with someone who's intellectually thoughtful and curious and who I think is occasionally wrong, rather than someone who's only telling me, well, this is what the opinion polls or the focus groups say. Because how do you argue against that, right? I want to know what's true, not what's currently popular, because you could try to change what's popular. But to do that, you first need to know what's true. To go back to the comment we had earlier, yes, it is observationally equivalent. I should go back a step. What the government has done on the tobacco industry is basically exactly what they would do if they were trying to help the black market. Now, I'm not saying that's what they're trying to do. Maybe they are. I don't know. I can't see into their hearts. They claim that they're trying to do something else. God bless them. Maybe they are. But what they're doing is exactly what they would do if they were trying to help the black market. And so is that malice or stupidity? Is that old saying, don't attribute to malice what can be explained with stupidity? Sure, probably. But it is interesting that there's the old saying of Baptists and bootleggers in cahoots over the alcohol prohibition in America back in the 1920s, where the two groups of people that really benefited from the alcohol prohibition, there was the Baptists who were trying to, browbeat people about, don't drink too much, don't drink too much. Speaking of which, and there was the bootleggers, the people who were then selling the illegal hooch, and they were the two groups that benefited. And the same with the cigarette black market. Maybe it is that the government has just decided it's important for us to have a black market. Maybe that is a strategic decision. And if you want a black market, they've gone about perfectly. They've gone about it perfectly to create that black market. So good on them. Well done. So now that we've got a few people in the room, I promise the last 20 minutes I wasn't just filibustering you, but it takes a while for a few people to get into the room. Look, here's, I guess, one of the big things I wanted to announce today. We haven't pushed it too much, but we're just about to. You would have heard previously my frustration about the income tax situation in Australia, specifically in this election. The Labor Party offered a fairly small, miserly income tax cut. I wish it was bigger, but a tax cut is better than not a tax cut. In my opinion, our income taxes are way too high. Any step we can take in the right direction is a step in the right direction. The Liberal Party, amazingly, I thought, responded to that by saying, no, they will wind back the tax cut, i.e. they will effectively increase the tax. The lowest tax rate has just been dropped from 16 down to 14. The Liberals say they will raise it back up from 14 up to 16%, and no other offsetting income tax cuts, right? They have the decrease in fuel excise, but that's only for 1 year, right? So then the income taxes are back up, and nothing offsetting it after that year. So you would have heard my frustration at that. Well, the ATA, Australian Taxpayers Alliance, we've decided to try and ramp up the pressure a little bit. I don't know if it's too late, but we've got to try. The goal here is to try to encourage the Liberal Party to realise that there is demand amongst the voting public, amongst their supporters out there for income tax cuts. And so we've set up this petition. You can see the URL there, taxpayers.org.au. You can just go to the website and look under campaigns. If you go under campaigns, you'll find this petition, or if you want to type it all out, petition Liberal tax cuts with dashes in between, you can see. And the idea there is to collect enough names, and then hopefully if we get enough names, take that to the Liberal Party and show them, look, there is a groundswell of support for this idea. It's not over yet. There's a long campaign to go. My hope is if the Liberals are looking for something to change the narrative, to change direction, and we can offer them some substantive ideas, which the ATA has been putting out, substantive ideas for the last month, and will continue to do that, and we can show them there is public support out there. There are people begging them to change direction and announce income tax cuts, then perhaps they will consider making an announcement during the course of their campaign. I mean, there's a track record of the Liberals making announcements late in the campaign. So there is some hope. I was, as you would have seen, quite depressed by the budget response, the part of the budget response that addressed income taxes. But let's not get too black-pilled straight away. Let's see what we can do about it first. And we don't have to do it too snarky. I know I can sound snarky when I talk about this sometimes, but I've tried to frame this as, we're here to help. And this is what a lot of your supporters want. This is what a lot of Australians want, not just for ourselves, right? We don't just income tax because we're earning money and we don't want to pay tax. That's probably true, but because we need it for the productivity of this country. Our income taxes are far too high. It's holding back productivity. We've been in a productivity slump for 8 years. That's the underlying cause of us being in a recession per capita for most of the last 2 years. There is no creating greater prosperity in this country without driving productivity. Every man and their dog says the word productivity. That's great, really good. Everyone knows how to say it and spell it. What do? We need serious income tax cuts. And so our motivation here isn't just self-interested. I want to keep more of my money in my pocket. There's an element of that. It would be great for us to keep more of our money in our pocket. But this is what you could do to try and put the economy on the back track. And if the Liberals are saying that Labor has driven the economy into the ground, fine. This is how you kickstart it, right? This is how you get the economy moving. Serious income tax cuts. So I should have done this beforehand. I'll see if I can bring up. There it is. This is the website's not very fancy because it was left up to me. I'm not a graphic designer, so we might get a fancy graphic on it later if that makes you excited. But the concept is the same. Income taxes are too high, drives up the cost of living, holds back productivity. This petition calls on the Liberal Party to announce significant income tax cuts, including ideally an indexation of the income tax brackets. And then you can just add your details, click the button, and Robert's your father's brother. So please consider going and checking that out. Please consider adding your name, share it far and wide, share it with family and friends. Let's see if we can get enough names on there that we can pass that on to the Liberal Party and have them take that seriously and very seriously consider a change of direction. So that brings me up to, I said before, we're putting on a series of ideas, and perhaps this is the wrong idea to do after the fact that I just appealed to the Liberals to accept our tax cuts. But I wanted to talk about a tax cutting idea that struggles to gain mass popularity. Perhaps it'll be more get a more sympathetic hearing amongst my usual crowd, but amongst the voting public, and that is cutting the top marginal tax rate, or at least relaxing taxes at the top of the income layers. Now I know the immediate sort of left-wing or media response is that those people are doing well. They don't need the money. And look, that's true as far as it goes. But my motivation in saying this was, firstly, I'm not in these brackets, right? So this isn't self-interest for me. But my motivation in saying this isn't that I'm saying, oh, these poor people on $200,000 and $300,000 and $400,000 a year, isn't it terrible for them? My motivation is productivity, right? Driving the economy. And it sounds trite and abstract and philosophical, but productivity is what drives average wages to be able to go up. I mean, we've been caught in a productivity stagnation for 8 years. Everyone feels like we're going backwards, and we are in many ways. We've had a recession for 2 years. People feel the results and they don't like it. And then they reach around, who can I blame? Blame productivity. Fix productivity, right? And if this is one of the places where you fix productivity, well then, even if it does accidentally help some rich people, no matter how much you hate them, even if it accidentally helps them, perhaps we should do it for the good of the economy writ large. So what I've done is the ATA has a behavioral tax model, where it's an income tax model where we factor in behavioral changes using the average of the best international estimates around the world for how people change their behavior in response to tax. So I've run the numbers on the top tax rate. So the top tax rate in Australia, by the way, is 47%, applying to incomes over 190,000. So incomes over 190,000, then you add 47, which is 45 plus the 2% Medicare levy. So that's the tax rate at the top rate. Now, if we abolish the top rate, now that's not within the Overton window, but just follow me for a moment here with this. If we abolish the top tax rate, that would go from 47 down to 39. Because the second top rate is 37 plus 2% Medicare levy, right? So that we'd still have a top tax rate. It would just now become a 39% top tax rate. So I modeled the results of that. And I've got it here. Like I don't know if it's worth sharing this because it's just me saying a bunch of numbers. But if we abolish the top income tax bracket, it would decrease income tax revenue by about 2 billion. Now, to put that into context, all of the other policy suggestions I've had over the last couple of weeks, they're all in the order of 2 or 3 or 4 billion. The budget is 42 billion in deficit. So 2 billion. But here's the kicker. It would decrease income tax revenue by about 2 billion. It would increase other tax revenue like GST by about 3 billion. This is probably roughly a break-even policy. All told, our top marginal tax rate raises approximately $0 for the government. I'll say that again, right? All told, once you factor in behavioral change and the impact on other taxes, our top marginal tax rate raises approximately $0 for the government. So why does it exist? Well, I think it's pretty self-evident why it exists. I tell you what, go out to a working class neighborhood or to a group of journalism students and suggest abolish the top tax rate, and they'll immediately go, no, you can't do that. You're just trying to help the rich. You're trying to help the rich. And there's the rub. Our top tax rate exists so that politicians can prove to voters that they don't like rich people. It doesn't exist to raise revenue. It doesn't raise revenue. All right, so just going on here, these numbers, so income tax down by 2 billion, other taxes up by about 3 billion, right? Similar enough numbers, let's say it's a wash, does basically nothing. It decreases this top tax bracket, decreases GDP by over 50 billion a year. So abolishing it would would increase GDP by about 50 billion a year. It would increase taxable income, so income that people report as taxable, by about 30 billion a year. Right? And then that taxable income is spent, and that's how you get your GST revenue, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a sad indictment on the nature of politics. So by the way, the numbers I'm using, this model I'm using, it is not some sort of quirky, out there, sort of crazy assumption model. It's using pretty mainstream numbers from a pretty well-studied area of economics. Right? It's using the crucial variable. If you're really curious out there, the crucial variable is the elasticity of taxable income. Right? And there's plenty of estimates out there to try to estimate the elasticity of taxable income around the world. Most of them in America, a bunch in Europe. The average elasticity of taxable income is probably around 0.3. But if you look at the elasticity of taxable income for high income people, it's far more like 0.6, 0.7, 0.8. So I used 0.6 in this model. So it's a fairly mainstream number. None of this is particularly weird or controversial. People can quibble and say, oh, it'll be 10% more, 10% less, fine. We can quibble. But the main point will still hold. The top marginal tax rate raises basically no revenue for the government. It shrinks our economy in the order of $50 billion. It slows down the growth rate, so that cost over time is going to get bigger and bigger. The only benefit from our top marginal tax rate is that politicians can prove to voters that they don't like rich people. That's kind of sad. Now, but anyway, having said all of that, you may remember when I started this process, I set myself the task, not just of what is good tax policy, because obviously abolish the top marginal tax rate. But that task in front of us here, if you're joining me in this task, is to work out a good policy that is also politically saleable. What is inside the Overton window? Now, firstly, just one last point on the radical idea of abolishing the top tax rate. That's what Paul Keating currently supports. He thinks the top tax rate should come down to 39%, right? It should be below 40%. Paul Keating, a former Labour Treasurer and Prime Minister, says it's exorbitant to have a top tax rate of 40% or more. And I think he's right. Having said that, given that our former Labour Prime Ministers are clearly far too right-wing for our modern Liberal or Labour Party, given that seems to be the case, inside the Overton window, what's a policy we can set inside the Overton? So here's a suggestion that I have. It is far more moderate than what I would want to do, but I think it could be saleable as part of a package. And that is currently the top tax rate, at 47%, that kicks in at 190,000, which is ridiculously low by world standards, right? I mean, that's less than double our average weekly earnings, the average full-time wage in Australia. And it's pretty rare worldwide to have people on less than double the average wage paying the top marginal tax rate, right? So normally in most countries, the top marginal tax rate kicks in much higher. It's intended for the really rich, not the kind of rich, not the a little bit rich. The top tax rate is intended for the really rich. So there's something that Australia could imitate. My suggestion, the inside the Overton window suggestion, is how about we increase the threshold so the top marginal tax rate only applies to people earning above 500,000 a year. So 500,000 a year or more. And that way we can keep the top tax rate only for the really rich. And so if the whole rationalization of keeping it is of course, it doesn't raise any money and it just holds our economy back, holds productivity back, makes the whole country poorer. But the whole rationale of keeping that top marginal tax rate is to prove how much you hate rich people. Then why don't you just prove how much you hate the really rich people and leave the people on $200,000 a year alone? Leave the people on $250,000 a year. Leave them alone from this just envious hate campaign. All right, so obviously imagine a mainstream party that embraced this idea would word it slightly differently, perhaps, but that's the pitch. And I think this, if you did this on its own, it probably wouldn't go anywhere. But we've already talked about a bunch of ideas in previous weeks. We've talked about raising the tax-free threshold, increasing the tax-free threshold further for married parents and for each child you have. We've talked about what were the other ones? Cutting the 10% rate of the Medicare levy, replacing LITO with a higher tax-free threshold. We talked about a bunch of ideas, tapering welfare. Nearly all of the ideas we've talked about so far primarily help people on low and middle incomes. And that's great because it makes sense, right? But if you are going to put together an entire package, I think this would easily make sense to include this watered down version of at least increasing that threshold so that the top rate only applies to the very rich. Now, I gave you the numbers before of what this would do if you abolished the top marginal tax rate, which of course we should do because it raises no money and it hurts the economy. All right, but let's park that for a moment. Let's just shut up, John, get over it. Not inside the Overton window yet. So let me just run through what the numbers are for my proposal, my sort of watered down proposal of just increasing the threshold to $500,000. So firstly, run that through the behavioral model. It'll reduce income tax by about $500 million and still increase other taxes by about $2 billion. So my suggestion here is almost certainly going to be revenue positive. But even it's certainly not revenue negative. You are not losing any money from my proposal here. You lose $500 million income tax. You'll gain about $2 billion in GST and other taxes. So on net, clearly doing better off in public finances, and GDP will be boosted under this policy by about $33 billion. Now, it's not the $53 billion that you'd get from abolishing it, C'est la vie, that's what you get. Still a $30 billion boost to GDP for the cost of the budget of zero should be recognized as a good tax policy. Those are the numbers we've got there if you run this through a behavioral tax model. Now, I'll note, if you don't run it through a behavioral tax model, if you run it through a model that assumes that nobody ever changes behavior, firstly, you are being fundamentally dishonest if you do that, because people do change behavior. But that will come up with a number saying, oh, this will cost the budget billions of dollars. And that's what you would expect from sort of the left-wing media, academia, bureaucratic set to make that case. But we should be able to argue back against that because they're just wrong. The whole reason we know income taxes are a bad idea is that they do distort behavior. We know that theoretically, and we know that in the data. And when you factor that in, these policies of adjusting the top marginal tax rate don't hurt the budget. They will help the economy. They are worth doing. And the way I suggested means you still get to do this sort of gratuitous look how much I hate rich people shtick, which apparently is necessary in this day and age. This is a very good point by Cora. We are giving childcare subsidies to some very wealthy people. So we're still willing to send them money as long as we're bribing them to not look after their own kids, because that is crucially important to the national self-interest, apparently, making sure parents don't look after their own kids. We'll give rich people money for that, but we won't let them keep their own income, even when what it would do is kickstart productivity, which is what we desperately need in this country. So it's a sad sort of indictment. So just the last thing I'll do before I wrap up is I've said here that income tax changes behavior, and maybe I'll do a fuller session on this at some stage. But the Treasury, the government will respond with, no, it doesn't change behavior, which is just absurd. We all know it changes behavior. Like there was actually a situation like this where the US bureaucracy used to claim that tax doesn't change behavior. And there was questions on notice from some senator, I can't remember his name now, asking them, well, what happens if we had income tax of 100? How much would that change the economy? And the answer was not at all. No, everyone would go to work. Every business would stay open. Everyone would work just as many hours. They would continue working for nothing. Every business would work for free. Every worker would work for free. And they would just keep working exactly the same, which is just self-evidently absurd. Of course, that is not true. Yeah, so we know that people change their behavior. We know theoretically why, and we've seen it in the data. There's 1,001 studies. They did a wonderful example in the UK where they looked at how much money they would raise by putting on a new top marginal tax rate. Now, they were smart and honest enough there to actually factor in behavioral change. They thought it would be fairly small. They thought it would be about 0.3. Then they did the experiment. They put in the top tax rate. They looked at behavior. Behavior changed by much more than they expected. And they went, oh, no, the behavioral change is actually much more like 0.6, the number I used. So this is known now. The Americans, when they were asked that question and had to give that embarrassing answer, the American bureaucracy now does factor in behavioral change when they look at tax cuts. The UK bureaucracy now does factor in behavioral change when they look at tax cuts. The Australian bureaucracy does not. Now, this is not just an issue of a bit of cultural cringe, how embarrassing our bureaucrats are dumb. This changes the nature of the debate. Like if you offer up a tax cut, like the tax cut I just suggested there. So I suggested that we increase the tax threshold for the top rate up to 500,000. And I said what that'll do is basically have no impact on revenue, probably raise revenue if you factor in GST, and it'll boost GDP by 30 billion. That argument's pretty good. Now consider if you assume no behavioral change. Do you know what that argument looks like? Then it looks like, oh no, this will cost 8 billion and raise GDP by 0. So by our bureaucracy not doing honest modeling, like just assuming that no one ever responds to incentives, which is just daft, and they know it's daft. It's not an assumption that the American bureaucracy or the UK bureaucracy or any honest tax economist makes. But if our bureaucracy makes this absurd assumption that no one responds to incentives, then when they describe a tax cut, they say, oh, it's bloody expensive and it has no benefit. Well, yeah, if you're going to explain it like that, of course it's not going to be popular. I mean, they are framing this issue so as to create negative public opinion about tax cuts. And imagine if I told you there's a policy, it costs $8 billion and gives no benefit. Do you want it? No. Well, what about if it's the policy, and this is the actual truth, factoring behavioral changes, it costs the budget zero and boosts GDP by 33 billion. Obviously, by factoring in behavioral change, you totally change the way you are describing a policy, and that changes the way that politicians talk about it. It changes the way that the media reports on it, and it changes the way people vote on it. And we currently have a bureaucracy that reports on tax changes in a dishonest way. And sadly, up until now, we've had major parties that just go along with it, even if they can be convinced that the Treasury is wrong. I mean, Treasury knows they're wrong. I've had chats with Treasury boffins about this. They just go, yeah, we're wrong. But they keep doing it. And even if you can convince a politician that Treasury is wrong, their answer is, well, yes, they might be wrong, but we have to do what they say anyway. Oh, you could have some gumption. You could have a backbone. You could make your case. The case is the whole reason we want income tax cuts. If you're not willing to argue that income taxes distort incentives and distort behavior and hold back productivity, that we can never have an argument for income tax cuts. You're just giving up the ground. You're just saying, yes, I agree with anything a green left academic or a Marxist says. I agree with all of their rationale, and I'll just try to sneak in an income tax cut when no one's looking. What a terrible way to do politics. We have to have people on the front foot actually making the case. This is why income tax is a problem. It distorts incentives, it distorts behavior that holds back our economy. I said maybe I'll do a deep dive on this at some time later, but just to touch on the ways that it actually does distort incentives and distort behavior. Because I just want to point out a lot of people, especially the people who suffer from having done 1 or 2 years of economics but didn't keep doing it, they will be able to, they'll note that there's a thing called labor supply elasticity, and that's what a lot of people think when you talk about income tax changes behavior. And there's some truth to that, but it's a very incomplete truth. So let me unpack that. At first blush, people think, oh, so if you have too high an income tax, that changes how much people are willing to work, right? It'll change like whether you're willing to take a job and whether you're willing to take overtime. And there is truth to that, right? There is some truth to that. But the evidence does show that for a lot of people, it doesn't change your behavior very much, right? The elasticity of labor supply is fairly low. And that's true. And then for some people, they go, oh, well, that's done. Problem solved. Income tax cuts don't hurt the economy too much. Keep ramping up. Firstly, if you ramp them up enough, you're still going to hurt the economy. But secondly, that's not the only way that income tax changes behavior. There are a whole stream of ways, right? The first thing to note is that you put up income tax too high. People might change whether they're willing to take a job and how much hours they do, but also how much work effort they do and what sort of jobs they do. But secondly, how they're going to arrange their tax structure. What's your incentive to tax minimize? If taxes are low, low incentive to tax minimize. If taxes are high, you'll pay an accountant and a lawyer to set up a trust, to set up a structure, to set up a company that shuffles your money through another company. And that's all perfectly legal. But taxes are too high, you create an incentive to have lawyers and accountants having a picnic with our tax system, which ends up raising less money, employing a bunch of accountants and lawyers and getting people out of their tax, but you don't raise money that way. So you incentivize tax minimization, changing work effort, tax evasion. Now people can say, you shouldn't break the law. That's nice. We can say it together. Let's hold hands, kumbaya, you shouldn't break the law. But newsflash, people still break the law. And the economics of crime is unambiguous. The greater the benefit of crime, the greater the incentive to commit crime. So the higher income tax, the higher the incentive for people to do income tax evasion. Obviously, we see that everywhere. I mean, Russia was a big example when they drastically cut income taxes. I think it's the 90s or early noughties. Then, like the next year, the amount of income being reported, a taxable income being reported, I think quadrupled or tripled or something like that. It went up some insane amount. Do we honestly think that people just worked 3 times harder, took on 3 times more jobs? And clearly what happened there was a massive drop in tax evasion. People just were willing to admit their income because it wasn't worth taking the risk of getting caught anymore because tax was low enough that you paid it. So you've got change in work effort, change in tax minimization, change in tax evasion, and then you've got jurisdiction shopping or hopping, moving between states, moving between countries. It could be you moving, it could be your capital moving. And again, we've got plenty of evidence that people move to try and seek out lower tax jurisdictions. Not everyone, not most people. You don't need most people to move. You just need some people to move, and it changes the situation. It changes how much industry is going on or work's going on in your jurisdiction. It changes how much revenue you can get because some people leave. I mean, very famously, Gerard Depardieu, the French actor. When France introduced a 75% top marginal tax rate, he took out Russian citizenship and gave up his French citizenship and paid 11% tax instead of 75% tax. And he's not the only one. Usain Bolt, for a while, was threatening not to go to the London Olympics unless London changed their tax rules. Right? So people do change where they're willing to go and where they're willing to live and where they're willing to invest. So you've got change in work effort, change in tax minimization, change in tax evasion, change in jurisdictions, and then we haven't even got the biggest one yet, change in willingness to invest. And this is one that is so often missing from the tax discussion, which I don't understand because it's such an obvious one. Capital, constant investment in new and better capital is the driver of productivity long term. It is the driver of growth long term. And obviously, the more you're going to tax the profits from a business, the less people are going to invest in that business. I mean, there's going to be a whole series of investment opportunities out there. And people might be willing to invest in a project if it makes a 10% return, right? That might be their cutoff. I'll invest if it makes a 10% return. And there's an investment out there that makes a 12% return. So will they invest in it? Yes, 12 is bigger than 10. They will invest in it. But if you tax the benefits of that, you tax that 12% return so that people only get to receive 6% return, then obviously now they're not going to do that investment. I mean, it's so bloody self-evident that that's going to change people's behavior. Are you going to invest in that piece of capital? Are you more likely to invest if you get a higher return or a lower return? Obviously, you're more likely to invest if you get a higher return. And this isn't only physical capital. This is somewhere where people might have an aha moment if you're grumpy about capitalists. This same logic also applies to human capital, i.e. education. Are you going to invest 8 years in becoming a specialist in some very difficult task if after you've got that education, you can't get paid for it? Or at least you get paid for it, but then you pay 80% tax on everything you get paid. So that's going to make you far less likely to invest in the education that makes you a specialist. So you're going to have less investment and less incentive for education if you have if you tax the benefit from investment and the benefit from education, which is your income, at a higher rate. And then even then we haven't got to the end of the conversation. Then we have these spillover effects, right? Just less business means less stuff you can buy, less benefit for consumers. As we said before, less other tax. It's not just income tax that'll go down, GST, payroll tax, stamp duties, etc. There's going to be then less savings twice. That's going to happen twice because firstly, there's going to be just less income to be saved. And secondly, less reason to save because you get lower returns on your savings. So less saving, less domestic investment, less money for charity. And the only thing you'll have more of is a much higher incentive for people to pay lobbyists to walk the corridors of Canberra to work out carve-outs and loopholes and like hundreds and hundreds of pages worth of deductions and offsets. So that you'll get more of. You'll get more lobbying, more lawyers and accountants doing tax minimization and more tax evasion. But you'll get less saving, less investment, less charity, less work, and less of the rest of it. So this is just a long way of saying, so maybe I don't have to do it later because I've kind of done it now, but this is a long way of saying some people, when they first look at this, they're aware that the labor supply elasticity, remember that's the first thing I mentioned, just high tax, will you take overtime? They're aware that the labor supply elasticity is relatively low. And that's true, right? They're not lying when they say that. That is a true thing they have recognized. But that is only one behavioral response amongst, like, how many did I list there? At least 10. Right? So they look at one behavioral response, see that it's small, pretend that small means 0, and then they just go on and say, oh, well, we don't have to factor in behavioral change. No, Treasury, listen to me. You're wrong. You have to factor in behavioral change. People do change their behavior when you change their incentives. It's like the first thing you learn in economics. Well, you should. So anyway, that's the long rant to justify the point why we should use a behavioral tax model, which is the model that ATA has used when we look at all these tax changes that we're doing. And we're happy to, if you've got a tax idea, contact us, jhumphreys@taxpayers.org.au, send me through your tax idea. I'll run it through our behavioral tax model. I'll tell you what it'll actually do to tax revenue, GDP, estimates for savings and investment and things like that, if you want to have a go. But for the moment, what I've done is I've put through this idea of increasing the top marginal tax rate. So that's the idea. I put that out there. I'll put it on paper soon, have it up on the website, and flick it around. Let me know what you think. Just going back to people's unwillingness to actually do things properly. Kuro once again with some wise words. If I wasn't taxed so much, I would donate to causes I think deserve it. Yes, they do. Well, you're not the only one. I mean, it's pretty self-evident. There's people often donate X percentage of their income. The income gets smaller, they'll donate a smaller amount. There is an absurd argument in some corners. This is actually from a Harvard-based professor, which just goes to show you can be very smart and very dumb at the same time. Because this Harvard-based professor has done some good work on estimating behavioral changes. And he worked out that he's actually where I got the estimate of 0.6. This is a left-wing socialist Harvard professor who estimated that high-income people have an elasticity of taxable income, behavioral change. I'd say in total, it doesn't even include all of it, but behavioral change of 0.6. So I took my data point from a lefty, so that people can't accuse me of cherry picking convenient outcomes. And he showed that there was this big behavioral change, and then he turned around and said, but it doesn't matter because we don't care about the utility that rich people get, because you get decreasing utility from money. Rich people are rich enough. It doesn't matter if we take away all their money. Now, here's the thing. Even if that's true, I mean, firstly, it's a little bit cheeky to say that we just don't care at all about the benefit a rich person gets from money, but fine, let's accept that. Let's fully accept that. What about the money the rich person gives away? I mean, it seems remarkable that they didn't factor that in. What about the money that the rich guy invests in a new business? Or what about that the rich guy now is working less, investing less, and so he makes less money, but who cares about him? That's the argument Saiz makes. That's the Harvard professor. Fine, but to make less money, he's made less stuff. Therefore, he's produced less stuff. Therefore, customers don't have his stuff. So fine, let's cry no tears for the rich guy that doesn't make money. But how about their customers? So I find that remarkable. It doesn't care about charity, doesn't care about the savings and investment coming from rich people, doesn't care about the products being produced by rich people. They see an opportunity to say we don't care about rich people, and then they just lock that in and screw the rest of the world. It is a sad indictment on the way some people approach politics. And none of my arguments here is saying, oh no, we need to care about the rich people. Not one of my arguments here was saying, what we really need is more sympathy for the rich. That's not my motivation. And maybe we do, maybe we don't. That's a moral question. I haven't touched it. That's not what my argument has been about. It's been about boosting productivity and the benefits that comes from that long term, especially the increased incentive to invest in capital and education, which we are currently holding back. We are holding back the incentive to invest. And our recent data is clear that the private investment is not growing. Private capital investment in Australia is not growing. And one part of the solution is cut income tax. I know some people will be thinking cut company tax. Sure, you can do that if you like. But just remember, in Australia, company tax is just a prepayment on income tax. Once you make the money from your company and money comes from the company to you, you pay income tax on the amount of money you get out of the company. So it's ultimately income tax sets your incentive to invest in a company, your incentive to invest in a piece of capital or invest in anything. And so that's why if you want to improve the incentive to invest, if you want more private capital investment, which you should, we need lower income tax, which is the theme that I keep coming back to, and I will keep coming back to because it's true, and we need to keep saying it until the major parties pay attention, which is a nice little segue back to this line, which is the major party that we would like to pay attention to this right now is the Liberal Party. Liberal Party, please look at this. Please be aware there is demand for you to cut income taxes. So where is it? Bring that back up there. Petition for the Liberal Party, for the Liberals to cut income taxes. This is something the economy desperately needs. It's also something that I think would help the Liberals in the polls. I mean, if you just wanted to do the Machiavelli, it's not my motivation. I mean, I want to do what's good for the economy, good for the country, good for the workers, good for consumers. But if your motivation was what's good for the Liberal Party, yeah, a tax cut would make you popular. So, please consider it. I'll take that as well. Both of us can put it up there. So yes, that's the pitch. That's the rationale. Today I've given the reason why we might want to have tax cuts at the top end as well. By no means is that the totality of our argument. All of my other ideas have been primarily focused on low and middle income, people benefiting from lower tax and tapered welfare. And we'll have a series of more ideas. And most of those are ideas that sort of benefit everyone or the lower middle incomes. But a holistic piece of income tax reform, I think would include either abolishing the top marginal tax rates or at least making sure they only apply to people who are genuinely too rich, or very rich. Right. So, I mean, boost it to 500,000, boost it to 1 million if you can, whatever you can get away with inside the Overton window. So that's the pitch for today. Let me know what you think. You can write in the comments even after this live stream's over. You can get in touch with us, Humphreys at taxpayers.org.au, or you can find us on the website. Our website is just the first part of what you see there, which is taxpayers.org.au. You can go there, check out the petition, check out the work we're doing on tax cuts, check out our other campaigns. If you like what we're doing, consider becoming a member at the top right corner. You can join membership. You can help us out with a couple of bucks a month. Or if you're rich, give us as much as you like. And maybe if we cut the top marginal tax rate, you'd have more money and you could join at a higher level. That's hypothetical for the future. But yes, so please consider supporting us as a member. If you can't support us as a member, that's fine. Some people can't. Please find us on the social medias. Go and find us on YouTube and Facebook and X. Give us a follow, share what we do, help us spread the word. And very importantly, for this session, please share that petition. Right? We don't get paid for that petition. That's not a money-making thing. That is because it would be a good idea to actually build political pressure on trying to get the Liberal Party to embrace income tax reforms for this election, because the country needs it, and the Liberal Party needs it. So thank you for listening in. That's the end of it for me. We'll be back Mondays and Thursdays, 8:30 p.m. Well, I believe we get rid of daylight savings soon, so it's going to be 8:30 p.m. for Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria. But 8:30 p.m. Mondays and Thursdays. You're always stuck with me. Sometimes I have an offsider or a guest. We'll see what we're going to have next week. I've got someone lined up. I don't want to confirm it yet in case it doesn't happen on the Monday. But you'll have to wait and see. Show off on Monday to see. But anyway, just about reached the hour. Perfect timing. My name is John Humphreys, and thank you for listening to ATA Live.